Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our final webinar for the winter season. My name is Maria Maddox, and I am one of your facilitators for today. Our session will be on cortical visual impairment and early intervention perspective, with our presenter being Mindy Ely from El Vista, the El Vista coordinator at ISU, and a doctoral student at U of I. I will let her introduce herself a little bit more when she gets started. Also facilitating today, along with me, is myself and Alyssa Jones, who's a research specialist at the EI training program and also a student at the University of Illinois.
Hey, thank you. So, good morning. I am very glad that you all joined us. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name's Mindy. I have two roles currently. I am the project coordinator for El Vista, which is a program at Illinois State University for vision professionals. You have to be trained as a teacher for the visually impaired, or an orientation mobility specialist can come in and take a sequence of classes, and when they're finished, then they will be trained to work in early intervention as a DTV, as a developmental therapist vision. So the idea is to get those people who have the vision background also trained in the birth to 3. So I do that, and then I also am a doctoral student at the U of I. So I'm taking I keep myself very busy with both of those two things. But I'm excited to share with you today because really early intervention is my passion. I love getting in there and helping families see the potential for their child. Vision loss is often a surprise. It's not usually something people know before the child is born, and so it is often a surprise and a really scary one for families. And so I like getting in there and helping families see that, yes, it is scary. It's probably not what they planned, but things can be wonderful, and we can work to solve any problems that come up. So I enjoy working with families. And I'm very excited with this El Vista program to be able to help others to be able to do the same thing, to get into early intervention and really work with those families and help them at a time that is often a crisis for them. So today, and I will also say that cortical visual impairment happens to be something that that is just something that I've studied a lot and worked with a lot, and is, again, another one of my passions. When Susan and Maria asked if I would be available and willing to do a topic, they asked what I would be interested in doing, and so I identified cortical visual impairment because it is it's very prevalent among those that have visual impairment, and it's something that has some specific strategies that we can do to help families. And so I wanted to talk about that with you today. My objectives for today is to go through, first I need to define cortical visual impairment so you have an understanding of what the field of visual impairment considers to be cortical visual impairment. And then also to talk a little bit about the visual system and diagnosis. And then the last half, we're really going to talk about services and adaptive strategies. But I need to talk about the visual system so that you understand what's going on and why we see the function that we see in kids with cortical visual impairment, because they are really different from one another. So it'll be helpful to go through that. I will give you several opportunities today to ask questions, but I want to invite you, as Maria said a little bit ago, I want to invite you to use the chat box to share ideas with one another. And again, I'm going to prompt that, especially in that last section where we deal with strategies, because I want to see what strategies you can brainstorm right now, but also things that maybe you've been using with families. So to begin with, we're going to talk about definition. What is cortical visual impairment? We'll get to a formal definition a little bit later, but for now, cortical visual impairment is a condition in which the brain does not process visual information appropriately. It can be due to trauma or malformation of the brain structures. It can be a congenital condition, and it can also result from an injury, maybe through the birthing process or early in life. it is the largest and fastest growing visual diagnosis. So of those that are considered to have a visual impairment, we are seeing more and more kids with cortical visual impairment. In fact, I looked through, you'll see in your handouts, I gave you, there's one handout that's kind of an outline of what we're going to go through today, and then the other handout is a list of references. What I did was I gave you the most current references that are out there that are applicable to the kind of the subjects we're going to talk about today. But man, CVI is changing like crazy. How we work with these kids, what we know about cortical visual impairment, just even understanding what's going on in the brain. All of those things are changing like crazy, and so it's important that when you look at resources that you're looking at really current information, because what we were doing 10 years ago, definitely what we were doing 15 years ago, is completely different than what we're doing today. So it's important. So on that reference list, I gave you a lot of really current things. But within those references, I kind of scanned through what was out there that gave percentages, and anywhere between 25 and 45% are what surveys and census and things like that are showing to be the percentage of the population of kids with visual impairment that have CVI. So let me say that again. Visual impairment is a low incidence diagnosis, but of those with visual impairment, of that group, almost half of them have cortical visual impairment. And that's why we say it's the largest and the fastest growing diagnosis within the vision field. It's the largest and fastest growing diagnosis. And it's really caused quite a I don't know if to say crisis, but it's caused quite an uproar in our training. The way we train professionals, we need to get information out there. We need to let people know what to do about this diagnosis on a intervention level. And so, again, that's why I was excited to touch this topic with you today. So I think we're going to do a poll next. I'm not sure if I go to the next. Yes. Okay, so how many of you, I was curious, I was asking Maria about this when we first got started. How many of you have a child with cortical visual impairment on your caseload right now? And you can do this with a raise of your hand.
Well, actually, they can use the poll function if they would. That'd probably be a little bit easier. That way we can get a count. So,
I'm sorry, okay.
Yeah, just go ahead and use the poll function, not the hand raise, if that would be helpful. You should have a checkbox in the poll icon so that it indicates it's a yes, no. We'll give folks another few seconds to respond. Looks like, and yeah, no matter what your role is in early intervention, if you're a service coordinator or an interventionist, or perhaps you're a parent who has a child with cortical visual impairment. So Mindy, it looks like of the folks who responded, about a quarter of the participants, 18 of them, have had a client or someone that they've worked with that has cortical visual impairment. Looks like about, not quite, but half have indicated, so you can see there.
Okay, good, and that's good to know. So I think that and I purposely put this survey question in before we get through the visual system, because I wanted to know how many of you had a diagnosis, had kids on your caseload with a diagnosis. What I think you're going to find as we go through this is that the strategies that we're going to talk about will work for a variety of kids, not just those that have the diagnosis. But I was curious to know how many of you are here today because you actually have kids with a diagnosis on your caseload right now. Okay, so statistically speaking, of those kids with cortical visual impairment, with the diagnosis of cortical visual impairment, this is from Babies Count, which is the National Registry for Children with Visual Impairments. They reported that, fairly recently, they reported that of those kids with cortical visual impairment, 15% of them just have cortical visual impairment. That's the only diagnosis they have. but the large majority of them have cortical visual impairment and something else, 29% developmental delay, and then 56% have cortical visual impairment and something else. And in that list were things like hearing loss, multiple impairments. So if you just add those percentages together, 85% of the kids have more than just cortical visual impairment. That's what we usually see. So how do we get the word, the terminology that we're using, cortical visual impairment? Really, the visual processing, the issues with vision that were based on visual processing were first identified in injured soldiers. And they actually called it cortical blindness, or blind sight sometimes. But the soldiers appeared to have no vision, but they could avoid or move toward moving objects, and typically in their peripheral field. And then during World War, and they were injured, so like people that were having head trauma or something from a blast or whatever, they were seeing this. In World War I and World War II, they did a whole lot more research. They got a better understanding of the visual pathways and kind of had something a little bit more to base what they were calling cortical blindness on. It wasn't until the late 80s that they started realizing that this was not only based on trauma that happened later in life, but something that could happen at birth, something that could be congenital. And so they started seeing similar symptoms. They called that cortical visual impairment. So the term cortical visual impairment was really the pediatric term used to identify visual processing. Okay, so think about this, the late 80s. I was in college in the early 90s. This was not something we talked about. This was something that anybody that's been in the field 20 years has probably had to get all their training on cortical visual impairment in the field. So it's definitely a need to get the information out there about how to work with these kids. And then speaking of terminology, it's still a battle. In the past 10 years, there's been a debate that's raised again. There's a discussion about whether we should be including just cortical injury that affects vision or a broader cerebral injury, which incorporates maybe the visual cortex and more. But as it's kind of settled, really, or I shouldn't say it's settled, right now, America tends to use cortical visual impairment. European countries tend to use cerebral visual impairment. I really think that we are going to fall to cerebral visual impairment, but currently we still tend to use the term cortical visual impairment more than cerebral. Either way, it's abbreviated CVI, and that's kind of what people are going toward. I will say that we're starting to see the pediatric added to the front. And so those that like cerebral call it pediatric cerebral visual impairment. Those that like cortical call it pediatric cortical visual impairment. But the terminology is indicative of what has happened through history. So we realize that there's a visual processing, realize that it can happen in pediatrics, and now we're questioning what exactly counts as CVI. Do we count just injury to the cortex, or do we count injury to more systems within the brain than just the cortex? So we'll see where we end up falling. So here's the official definition. I purposely saved this because it's a little bit heavy, but CVI is defined as impaired vision that is due to bilateral dysfunction of the optic radiations or visual cortex, or both. Okay, so I'm going to try to use the tools here to draw on the screen. So this area right here is the lateral geniculate nucleus, and that's kind of the midbrain. That's where, let's see, so the visual information comes in through the eye, then it goes down this visual pathway. When it gets to the LGN, this area right here, then it goes down these optic radiations. So cortical visual impairment, or CVI, is dysfunction that happens behind this LGN. Okay, let me, Maria, how do you clear that? I forget. Can you erase that so it's not so messy? Thank you. So these radiations of the optic nerve are a part that can be injured. This area back here is the visual cortex, okay? And it's really the primary area for visual understanding. And then from there, the information goes on, and we're going to leave that and goes to other parts of the brain, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But injury to the brain centers, the processing areas, it is necessary for diagnosis of cortical visual impairment. But you can have that at the same time and also have ocular, meaning injury here in the eyeball, or I shouldn't say injury, malformation or something wrong with the eyeball. And you can also have cortical visual impairment in combination with some kind of ocular motor dysfunction. So the muscles that control the eyeball, there can be problems there, and you can still have CVI in addition. You just have to have some involvement in this back part of the brain. Okay, so let me let that sink in just a little bit. And I'll go to the next slide. So that area that's circled, if there's an injury and it happens beyond the LGN, that's what we're talking about when we say cortical visual impairment, or CVI. Okay, so now let me try to give you a little bit more detailed explanation of what's going on with the visual system, and also get a little bit into the function of what's happening. So, electrical impulses leave the back of the eye and travel down the optic nerve. Okay, so they leave the back of the eye, they travel down the optic nerve and to the primitive brain, which is in this area where the LGN is right there too. This is the part of the brain that generates protective responses, that midbrain. That's the protective responses. So you blink or you duck when a ball is thrown at you. That happens before you have any processing of visual information. That's just reflexive. The peripheral, motion detection seems to be more responsive based on information that's in that midbrain. That's why sometimes you can see a child who appears to have no vision, and maybe they can't even move their limbs, but they can turn their head and open their mouth to a moving spoon in their peripheral field, or respond to some item that's in their peripheral better than they can their central vision. That's because this midbrain is really attuned to that kind of information. So when we leave then the LGN, the lateral geniculate nucleus, the information travels down the optic radiations, that's all these little fibers here, to the visual cortex, or the occipital lobe. Okay? From there, the information goes out to other areas of the brain, so that we can process it and do something with the visual information. We call this portion that's on the top, this is the dorsal stream. This portion on the bottom is the ventral stream. Okay, so I'm going to go through each one of those and explain that a little bit to you. When information leaves, so we're going to talk about the dorsal stream first, this top one. This is the doing system. It helps us plan and decide what to do with visual information. So information goes, and it's not necessarily in this order, but I'm going to talk about it in order. So the first one, we'll say the parietal lobe. Well, that's working. It helps you to handle complex information coming in. For example, imagine you're looking at a Where's Waldo picture. Remember those Where's Waldo really confusing pictures? That parietal lobe helps you focus on pieces of that picture. A different part of the brain identifies the components, but the parietal organizes the chaos. So a child with injury here has difficulty knowing where to look or focus, how to look at one object in a busy scene. They often look unfocused. The next one is when along that dorsal stream is the motor cortex. So in this area, your visual system communicates with your motor systems on how to pick up something or how to move to something or how to plan your body movement. So you see the information and you say, yep, I want that. I'm going to go for it. Then your body has to organize those motor movements. So if you see a cup and want to pick it up, the dorsal stream will provide the motor cortex with the information needed to form the position of your hand to fit to the size of the cup, where to put your arm and your hand so it's not, you don't overreach or underreach the target. If you're walking, the dorsal stream helps you coordinate movements, especially when the terrain is uneven. Like if you're walking on grass or something and it's bumpy, you've got to differentiate where those feet should go. Or if you're going up steps, or visually, if it looks like there's going to be a change in height, you've got to interpret that. And for example, if you go from the carpet to a wood floor, it might look like there's a height difference there, but there might not necessarily be a height difference, and so your body has to register that, understand it, and then move accordingly. So let me give you an example. A child with an injury here has difficulty coordinating vision and motor. They tend to look away to minimize competing information between motor and vision. We see this so often. Kids with CVI will look at something and then they look away and reach for it, because if they are trying to reach while they're looking, they have a really hard time coordinating the two pieces of information that aren't working well together. They may overreach, they may underreach. I had a little girl once whose, every time she wanted to reach for something, her hands would go straight up to her face. They actually went to her mouth. It took us a really long time to help her coordinate that vision and that motor. She actually eventually got it and figured out that she had to go, what it meant or what it looked like to go out with her hands instead of in with her hands when she wanted to reach for something. And once she got that, it wasn't necessarily coordinated. She still overreached, but at least she realized the direction of her arm movement and what that looked like. It was almost like it was backwards in her mind. Like if I was trying to do something while looking in a mirror, my brain is telling my motor to do something different than what I see. It was that kind of a situation. The next one, the frontal lobe, this allows it's where executive function occurs. It allows the head and the eyes to move to a new target. It allows you to organize and scan the scanning of the environment so that you can actually move your head and your eyes and decide where you want to look. All that executive function, all that decision making related to vision happens here. We see this difficulty often in children with CVI. They have to work to organize visual scanning and head movements. When they try to change focus, the movement is slow and labored. Have you seen this? It's really common. They're really slow to move to a new visual target and to get that done. As you can imagine, fast-moving visual information is really frustrating. For example, a car ride can be difficult. A busy environment like a shopping center or maybe the church, right, when everybody's walking all over in the hallways, that can be really overwhelming, and they might cry. They might actually, a lot of times, they'll just shut their eyes, just cut off the visual information. Okay, so let's talk about the dorsal stream. Let's talk about the ventral stream. The ventral stream is more in the bottom of the brain. This is where the visual library of things are, so you remember seeing something. This is where you identify objects, shapes. This is where facial recognition happens. It's possible to have injury to the facial recognition centers, yet still be able to recognize other objects. More typically, though, you see injury to both the facial centers and the centers that allow you to recognize objects and shapes. Children might be unable to differentiate their mother from another person of similar size or hair color. It can impact bonding with the family. The child may not be able to recognize even familiar objects. When face recognition is really probably the hardest thing for families, though. It also, because of the bonding issues and the child not recognizing the family, but there's problems later with recognizing facial expression and emotions, and it is difficult socially if you can't recognize emotion and facial expression. Usually there is a need to determine these things and to recognize people, to recognize emotion through auditory information. Because if you have damage to those facial centers, it's just not something you're going to be able to do. Okay, so just a little simulation here for fun. So when this slide changed, you saw a picture. But if you really let your ventral and your dorsal stream work, you can perceive more. So you look at this picture. What I want you to do is there's a ton of faces that are hidden in this picture. So you do that while I talk to you a little bit about what's going on in your brain. So your parietal lobe will organize information. It will recognize in your ventral stream, you will recognize familiar shapes and interpret what they are. Your frontal lobe will allow you your executive function to work so that you can move your eyes to different portions of the picture and start that process all over again. If I asked you to put your finger on your computer screen where you see a dog, you would have to engage your motor cortex in conjunction with your visual centers. So, okay, just so that I don't leave anybody hanging, do you see the dog? Somebody said I first saw the old man. Yeah, okay, so let me point some of these out so I don't flip and then you're like, what was this thing? So the dog, I see 5 and the dog. Okay, 5 faces. So here's the dog. Oh, I should probably get a different color besides black. Okay, so here's the dog. And then maybe you saw the old man that's right here. I put that arrow on the top of his head. There's also, or maybe you saw this old man. And then there's also a lady holding a baby, so there's 2 more. There's silhouettes, or there's, not silhouettes, there's profiles also. If you look, up here's one. You can see the eye right here, and the nose and the mouth make up this. And then there's, if you go to the other side, there's 2 more. There's one here looking this way, and there's one looking that way. And then I just wrote on top of kind of a baby in the clouds. So, okay. Anyway, you saw something, but then when you look at it, you perceive the information. And that's those ventral and dorsal streams working to really take the information and process it. Okay, tough to talk about the visual system not being face-to-face with you. So I want to ask you if you have questions about the system and how it works before we go further and talk about diagnosis and other things.
Okay, folks, so make sure you're using your chat box. Mindy, at the moment, I haven't seen any questions come through. I think you've been explaining it really well, and I know it is hard to not have that visual feedback of faces to see if you've got folks understanding or not. But, I mean, from my perspective, it sounded really well, and it's kind of funny because it just reminded me so much of my son, because he does look, he'll look at something, and then he'll look away before he reaches for it. So.
Yeah, and that's really typical.
Like, ooh, ding, ding, ding. But anyway, I'm not.
Okay, there's a couple of questions that have just come through while you were
talking.
talking.
I'm not seeing any questions come through.
Somebody
yep,
said,
there we go.
so how does trauma happen really deep in the brain? So if you think about, it doesn't have to be trauma. It can be malformation, and that can happen deep in the brain. Also, brain bleeds. If there is bleeding within the ventricles, that is a major way of having damage to the cortical. It actually happens in those striations. But if there's bleeding within the ventricles, that will cause swelling, and that internal swelling can damage the brain tissue, and it will cause issues that are like CBI. And somebody said, I wonder if this not looking is similar to autistic. Who don't want to look. It's actually, I don't know, because they're not exactly sure what's going on there, but I believe it's a bit different. And I only say that because I've done some research on autism, and I've done lots and lots on CBI. But I'm just one opinion, and there's lots of opinions out there. The stuff that has to do with autism has a lot to do with, it seems to be more executive function, so I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It does look similar, though. But there's some strategies that we can use with kids with autism that we would definitely consider strategies we use with kids with cortical visual impairment. It's kind of a trial and error thing. Okay, I thought this was an actual blindness. What you are describing to me is altered vision depending on the child. I'm reading what Lisa wrote. Although this was I thought this was an actual blindness, what you're describing to me is altered vision depending on the child. Yeah, it's processing. It has to do with the processing of the information and understanding what you're seeing and what to do with that information and how to move your body based on that. So, okay. If there's no other questions, let me go on to diagnosis. Diagnosis basically boils down to the presence of 3 different criteria. And this was first proposed by Christine Roman, who you'll see her name several times on the reference sheet. There are a handful of people who have done a lot of work in the world of cortical visual impairment and in the visual impairment world, and she's one of them. So I just want to give credit where credit is due. I'm seeing out of the corner of my eye that Maria said one question was missed. Maria, what was the question?
Okay, it looks like there was one question about talking about how various light sources impact visual perception. So.
Oh, okay. You know what? I'm going to put that one off because we're going to talk about that quite a bit later. Definitely light is the easiest thing to see, and so kids with CVI who have difficulty seeing, light is a big help, and so we use that a lot in promoting vision, in encouraging vision, in getting them to look. We definitely use that a lot. Okay, would this be characterized as visual processing disorder within a sensory processing disorder? There's been a lot of talk about whether it is, and this has been the movement between the 90s and the last 15 years. Is it a processing disorder, or is it a visual impairment? And they've come down to calling it a visual impairment. It's the World Health Organization has actually been active in this, and Colin Brander, let me see if I have him on your reference. Well, let me give you the name because I don't have him on your list. Colin Brander, you might look up his stuff. It's COLANBRANDER maybe. He has done some work. No, Colin Brander is his whole last name. That's the last name, Colin Brander. So it's not considered a processing disorder. I say it is visual processing, but it's actually considered a visual impairment. Okay, what about shaken baby and ischemic? Yes, definitely, and we're going to get into that. Okay, so the diagnosis, there's basically 3 different ways. First of all, there has to be an eye exam that doesn't match visual function. What I mean by that is, so the eye, an internal eye exam, they look at the retina, they look at the visual structures within the eyeball, and there may or may not be damage there, but the function is not matching what is seen on the visual eye exam. In other words, it's not just the damage to the retina that's causing the function, the visual function that we see, so there must be something beyond just the damage to the eye. That's the first clue. Secondly, there needs to be some kind of brain involvement. And as somebody just put earlier, what about ischemic and stuff like that? Yeah, the most common causes I have listed here, lack of oxygen. That's asphyxia. There can be, it basically boils down to 3 different ways. There can be some kind of malformation. One of the most common malformation would be PVL, periventricular leukomalacia. There's damage there, and it causes, a lot of times can cause CVI. But some kind of malformation. There can be an infection, meningitis, encephalitis, something like that can cause damage to centers that will cause CVI. There can be, or there can be some kind of trauma. So during the birthing process there was cardiac arrest, or there was some other reason for lack of oxygen. Some kind of injury that happens after the fact, a head injury, and that would be like you're talking shaken baby. Those are the common causes for CVI. They have research is showing that the leading cause, the most common, is asphyxia, which would be lack of oxygen or cardiac arrest, would both lead to asphyxia. So those are common causes. So when we get talking of diagnosis, first of all, there has to be an eye exam that doesn't match. There has to be some kind of history of brain involvement. And then finally, there needs to be some characteristics. And again, back to Christine Roman. Christine has there used to be long, long lists of characteristics, and we've kind of boiled it down to 10. And these have been outlined by Christine Roman and is used in her in her assessment tool. But basically, there's functional implications that are outlined by these characteristics. In your handout, I have listed these 10 characteristics, but in the last portion of what we're going to do today, we're going to go through each one and talk about what it means, what it looks like function-wise, and then strategies that can be used when you see this as an issue for the child. But let me just say that kids are so different, and how these present are different by child. And so it's difficult to give you, and maybe even bad practice, to give you here's what a list of here's what you should do. You really have to look at the child, have to look at their function, and then determine what is the best way to support their vision and their needs. So we're going to go through those 10 characteristics in a little bit. So what is, now this is a quiz to see if you can remember what I just said. What is the leading cause of CVI?
So again, this is your poll function. If you find that box with the letter in it and open it up and see what your answers will be. We've got choices 1A through E. Folks, a few 5 to 10 seconds to respond. What is the leading cause of CVI? Give folks another few seconds here. All right, let's see what we've got. Alyssa, how did folks respond? Perfect. So over half of you, almost all of you, the ones that responded, said asphyxia. So, all right.
Okay, very good. Yes, asphyxia is definitely the leading cause of cortical visual impairment. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the services that we're that are needed for a child with CVI. First of all, unlike any other visual impairment, children with CVI actually show improvement in vision. Researchers disagree about whether this is functional improvement or whether it's physiological rewiring of damaged visual pathways. But either way, research shows that at least some improve. And some researchers are even suggesting that even 95% of the cases show some improvement. And I don't mean 95% improve all the way, because that actually is really rare to see complete improvement, to see full recovery. But you really do see improvement in most cases. But therapy does not work if strategies are administered by a therapist once a week, and definitely if that therapy takes place outside of the child's daily routines. So what's the solution? Parents. Parents who are with their child daily, they have to learn and implement the strategies. It just has to happen. It just has to happen all the time and throughout daily life. It can't be a pull-out thing. You know, bring your baby to me and I'll fix them. It doesn't work that way. It has to be something that is within their daily routine. That's just developmental, but it's also definitely true of, it's developmental age-wise. Any child in that birth to 3 range, it needs to be in their daily routines, but it is really, really important for this population because it has to happen more than just once a week. It has to happen a lot. So the other thing is the team has to work together. And it is essential to the team that there's a DTV when you've got a diagnosis of CVI. So I'm going to talk about the DTV specifically because that might be the one on the team that you haven't heard of before or you don't have a lot of experience with. But that's not to say the DTV is the most important. It's just the one that's a little bit odd or a little bit different. So a DTV is a developmental therapist vision. That's an individual with a bachelor's degree as a special educator of children who are blind or visually impaired. In the 3 to 21 world, they're called a teacher for the visually impaired. In the birth to 3 world, they're called a developmental therapist vision. So that person is trained to assess functional vision and provide habilitative support to help families thrive in spite of visual impairment. A DTV also possesses specialized training in blindness-specific skills and materials. So not necessarily with kids with CVI, but with kids just with other visual impairments. A lot of what we work on is Braille, pre-Braille skills, compensatory techniques. You know, like if you can't see and you drop an item, there's certain techniques that you use to find those items. And mobility, that's taken care of by the person called the DT-O&M, the Developmental Therapist Orientation Mobility. But specifically, DTVs are trained in strategies for working with children with CVI. But the team doesn't end there. Many families will also need the specialized support of OTs and PTs or DTs. As a team, those professionals can help families attain their objectives. But timing is really important when we're talking about CVI. CVI has the best potential for improvement if services are administered early. So it's really important to get all those people in place so that the family can get strategies and start putting those into their daily lives. So a DTV will begin by completing a functional vision assessment. And they'll use the medical records as a baseline when they complete the functional vision assessment. It's designed to identify how the child uses his or her vision in the natural environment, that's kind of the difference between, not the only difference, but it's one of the big differences between a functional vision assessment and the assessment that the doctor does. The DTV really wants to know, okay, this is where the child lives, then let's see how they use their vision in this environment, not in a specialized clinical environment, but in their home environment. Then they'll work to understand the supports that they need to help their child attain the best use of vision. And that gets, somebody asked earlier about lighting and things like that. Right, the DTV in a functional vision assessment, I'm going to call it an FVA. In an FVA, they will figure out what kind of lighting is helpful, what kind of lighting is distracting, how should that be positioned, things like that. So here's another example. The DTV might find that while the medical exam shows that the child has the ability to use the lower field of vision, but there's no actual damage to the retina or the optical structures. It's really a neglect based on visual processing, then that information will be used to help support the child. So we might need to bring objects in from the upper field to get the child's attention. Or based on the child's functioning, they may or may not be able to attend to that item if it's moved to the neglected lower field. So an FVA, it's going to look at what are the child's strengths, what are their weaknesses, what adaptive strategies are needed to best support daily functioning. That's what they're going to really concentrate. And it takes a long time. It's going to take an hour or two to do a functional vision assessment, a really good one, especially on a child with cortical visual impairment because there's so much involved there. And it might very well take more than one visit with the family. But they're going to, and they typically are going to use the CVI assessment scale, and which was published by Christine Roman. Again, I'm using her name, but she's not the only one that's out there. She's just has put many things out that are useful in a practical sense. And that scale is based on the 10 characteristics that I showed you a little bit ago. So then once the evaluation is complete, the DTV will use that to help the team determine strategies that they can incorporate to maximize the benefit of vision for the child in all situations. But please be aware that a child with CVI use of vision is extremely taxing. It's likely and probably even recommended that portions of the day be accomplished without requiring the child to use their visual sense. When motor skills are required, it often makes sense to be selective about when to use vision. And every child is different, so that needs to be assessed. And again, I'll say I hesitate to even give guidelines because you just don't know until you see the child. You have to determine based on the child's abilities what they need and what they don't need. But believe me when I say that the DTV will provide very detailed guidelines based on the FVA. So if you have a child with CVI that's on your caseload, you need to be in contact with the DTV so that you can work with them to figure out strategies to do whatever it is that you're trying to do. Once the FVA is complete, it's important to work with the family to identify daily routines. And those routines are going to be the basis for how the strategies are put into the family's life. So, for example, if you have a child that identifies a car ride as really traumatic, one strategy might be you might black out the window next to the child and place a towel over the back of the seat and hang a single colored toy in the child's field. That can really simplify the environment and give them something to focus on and maybe make the car ride not so traumatic. Secondly, it's important to help families understand why they're doing what they're doing. We also want to encourage them to brainstorm with us. If we can show something new, if we show them something new, they need to do it, not just us. That empowers them to use the strategies when we're not there. Like I said, 1 hour a week is not going to do it, especially with a child with CVI. Parents need to integrate the strategies into daily routines where it makes sense for them. It's not only EI philosophy and best practice, but it's best for getting results for these kids. So here's another poll.
All right, folks, so use your poll function, the fourth icon with the letter inside, and identify which professional is trained as a special educator of children who are blind or visually impaired. So this one should be a given. Let's see. We'll give folks a few more seconds to respond. Looks like I'm watching the answers as they come in, and it looks like everybody's answering the same thing, Mindy. So I think you've got them well.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah, let's see. What do we have? There we go.
Wonderful. Okay. And let me reiterate, the DTV happens to be their background is vision, but it's important that that the team have a good understanding of how to work with kids with cortical visual impairment. And so that's, again, why I was interested in providing this topic to when I did this webinar, because I think it's important for the OT, I think it's important for the PT and the developmental therapist and the service coordinator to have some ideas about how to work with these kids. Okay. So next we're going to talk about identifying adaptive strategies. Now, here's the 10 strategies. If you look on your handouts, those strategies are listed there. I'm going to go, the next slides are just going to be one by one. I'm going to go through these 10 strategies. So behaviorally, children with severe CVI tend to stare at lights. Even those with less severe CVI are often attracted to lights. They might stare at windows, TVs, computer screens, ceiling fans. If that's a characteristic that's prominent for a child, then we must consider how it affects his or her needs and also how we can use that characteristic to the child's advantage. For example, as the DTV completes the functional vision assessment, she'll work to understand how the child responds to lighted items, lights that reflect items, and non-lit items. Understanding the least amount of support necessary to elicit a visual gaze will inform needed adaptations. I'm going to go through about the first 4 of these, and then I'm going to give you, and then we're going to do not a simulation. I'm going to ask you to brainstorm about a scenario. Okay, color and movement. So Roman Lanzi has noted that children with CVI have preferred color. She indicates that most children prefer red or yellow, but can have other preferred colors. There was a study done in 2005 by Cohen-Mider, and I think I put that on your reference sheet. Yep, I did. And they found that while children had a strong preference for color over gray images, the children did not prefer one color over another. Okay, so that there's a debate in the field. I don't know. Do they have a color preference or not? I don't know. In my experience in working with children, they tend to have certain colors that they look at. Some have said maybe that's because they're used to those colors. Their brain has done the work to identify those colors, and so it's easier for them. Whichever, but if you read this study that was done in 2005, it was really specific, and they came out with some pretty strong results showing that maybe children didn't have a color preference. So I don't know, but the same study they did confirm one of the claims of Roman Lanzi, and that is that children attend to movement more easily than stationary objects. This is really key for you to understand. When you're showing an object to a child, if you will give it a slight bounce, not fast moving because that causes other problems, but a slight bounce, it will stimulate the brain vision centers in a different way and give them more chances to see. It seems that color and movement both draw and hold visual attention. That study in 2005 showed they didn't have a color preference, but it did show that they looked better at high contrast. So I don't know, is it color preference, or when you show them red on white background, that's high contrast, so that seems helpful. So, I'll also say that Dutton, again, this is, I don't know, it's one of the studies, I think it's that 2014 study by Dutton. He cautions that fast-moving objects negate the movement benefit by interfering with the child's ability to perceive the object. The dorsal stream is often impaired in children with CVI. When objects move too fast, the impairment to the dorsal stream interferes with visual perception. So just a slight bounce is all that's needed. Here's another issue, visual novelty. That refers to the benefit of using familiar items. If the dorsal stream is impaired, object identification is difficult. So when you use new items, they have to do all that work all over again to figure out what it is. If you use familiar items, that saves the child from that hard work of identifying and decoding a new object. So if you're going to bring in something, you might as well just leave it with the family for a week, and then the next week you can try using it. But if you're trying to use a new object, the first day you're there, they're going to have a hard time. You're better to use things that are found in the home. Again, we consider that best practice anyway, to use things that families have in their home and they can use when you're gone. So that could be a good thing all the way around. Latency refers to the need for time to process. This is extremely common in children with CVI. They often need time to process visual information and time to organize their vision and motor senses. It's imperative that all those working with children with CVI become aware of the child's need for wait time. It should be noted that wait time is best given in silence, and I'm underlining that, silence. When sound, and I'm talking voice, if you're trying to be encouraging and you're saying, look at this, look at this, look at this, that helps for any other child with a visual impairment. But with CVI, it's difficult. It requires them to use their auditory sense and their visual sense. There's confusion going on there, and it doesn't work. So it needs to be done in silence. Even music in the background. This isn't for all. Some kids are okay with that, but a lot of kids have difficulty with music in the background, or heaven forbid the TV be on. That's going to be really distracting. So that all of that can interfere with visual processing. And this latency can be long. I've seen kids who need 15 to 20 seconds of wait time. And that means, so I'm holding out an object, I'm giving it a slight bounce, I'm in their good peripheral field, and I just wait in silence. And if you wait long enough, sometimes, not always, but sometimes you'll see the child slowly move their head, and then usually comes their eyes, and then they look at the item. So it's important that you figure that out. Again, the functional vision assessment is going to look for latency, and then they will give you that information. Yes, the child is has latency. It lasts for about this long. Noise is or isn't a problem for latency. So anyway, that FBA will give you that information. Okay, so we've gone through the first 5: light gazing, color preference, movement, visual novelty, and latency. I'm going to share a situation, and what I want you to do is brainstorm with me. So I'm going to give you a scenario, and then I want you to use the chat box to give some ideas, okay? And then I'm going to give you some ideas also, but I want you to brainstorm some things in the chat box. So consider the child who has severe cortical visual impairment and displays the characteristics we've just mentioned, all those 5 issues. So this is what it looks like for him. He can look at reflective objects like a mylar or reflective CDs for some time, but he more easily looks at lights. He will look at objects that are brightly colored if they are lit and moving slowly. He must investigate new items for several minutes, and so works better with familiar items. He has latency of about 10 seconds when he begins to use his vision. After a visual episode, his latency shortens up by a few seconds, and actually that's really typical in kids. They may have latency of 10, 15 seconds, but then it can shorten up as they kind of get their visual system warmed up. But he requires a quiet environment with some wait time when he's working. Okay, so now we've talked to the family. Consider mealtime. The family would like him to be active in the feeding process. He uses a sippy cup and is spoon fed. What supports might be good to try? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about this and come up with some strategies. And I'm reading what Maria wrote.
So while you're waiting, use your chat box to type in some of your strategies and responses, and see what you think here.
Just kind of go through the 5. What would you do with light? What would you do with color preference? What would you do with moving? What would you do with visual novelty? Okay, white tablecloth, bright colored cups. I like that you're thinking of the background. Okay, add color preference to the sippy cup. Nice. Okay, just looking at the clock, I'm going to give you some ideas, but you keep going, okay? So here's some ideas. Put the window or other light source to his back so that he's not distracted by the light and can focus on the food. And I'm just saying that as could go either way. It depends on the child. So some kids, I've had one little one who we put a flashlight taped to the bottom of the spoon, and it helped her use the spoon independently. First try, it was amazing. Couldn't scoop, put a flashlight on there. It just helped her know where the spoon was and where it was going. But okay, I'm getting sidetracked. So here's a suggestion. Put the light source to his back so it's not distracting him. Use a sippy cup with a red lid so that he can see where his mouth should go. And somebody mentioned marking the sippy cup. Use a red spoon that he can see it coming toward his mouth. Hold the spoon and wait until he turns before bringing it to his mouth. This gives his latency time to adjust. Consider feeding him with limited additional sound. Turn off the TV. Give the spoon a slight and slow bounce as you wait for him to see it. This will engage and support that provided. It'll provide the support that's needed for movement. See how I'm saying you identify what the strategies are, and then you look at their daily routines and how can you slide those strategies in. Then it doesn't become homework for the family. It becomes part of their life and helps them figure out how to function in their life while supporting vision. Here's another one. Consider that same child. The physical therapist is working with core strengthening exercises. What could be done to encourage the child to hold visual focus, to motivate holding the head up, specifically holding the head up? And a lot of times PTs will use a visual point of focus in order to get that done. So what are some strategies? Okay, somebody said maybe use an auditory. So maybe choose this to be not a visual activity, but choose it to be auditory. That is definitely a reasonable way to do it. Okay, light box in a dark room, definitely we've done that. And sometimes like I've used those. Oh, that's Diane. Hi, Diane. I have seen use a gel ball and put a light inside of the ball, because then I can roll the ball back and forth slowly, again in a little bit of a dimly lit room. Okay, here's some ideas, but you guys keep chatting away. Use a favorite light or a lighted source for a focused object. Keep sound and even encouraging words to a minimum. That's the hardest one, is not talking through the whole thing. Give the object a slight bounce so the movement will attract and maintain visual attention. So using those strategies that are helpful for the child. Okay, complexity. I'm going again through the other 10 characteristics. Complexity, complex visual images are really difficult for children with CVI to understand. Complex images or backgrounds tax both the dorsal stream's ability to organize and focus on visual information and the ventral stream's ability to identify the shape and or recall the image. So simplicity of shape, of color, and of detail are really important. Children will have difficulty finding their toys on a busy background, like a patterned blanket or a full toy box. They may have difficulty differentiating between people. Complexity causes problems seeing their spoon coming towards their mouth against the background of the whole rest of the room, and that can be really difficult. So I put this slide in that has a lot of different examples. This picture right here, we use a lot of these black carousels. These are just, you buy them at Hobby Lobby in the art center. My son uses them for science projects. So they're just portfolio boards, and they can be used to block out the busy background. This picture right here is the same scene, but from the child's point of view. This is one that a parent made. It's between two cabinets, and they provided these are those pop lights. So there's some light in there, and then this is a busy box. It's just it has all kinds of things to reach for. This actually is in a classroom, so this would be with a little bit older children. This family, this bottom left picture, this family made this. She was interested in crawling. She wanted her child to crawl. She made a tunnel out of PVC pipe. Like, I came one day and she had done this. This was not my idea. But she made this tunnel, and we took one side down just for the picture. But there's really a black piece that goes over here. She left the top open so the light could get in. And she hung down single-colored reflective objects to entice her child to move forward. This is like extreme. I've seen most people just use a lighted source to go for, but I thought it was a great idea, and the little girl loved it, and she would a lot of times just roll over on her back and start playing with things. But Parents have ideas too, and I think it's important to support their ideas and encourage them. That was a parent who took the strategy she was learning and ran with it, and I loved that. Okay, another issue is visual fields. The visual fields are rarely intact in kids with CVI. It's important to talk with a DTV about the way the child uses his fields or how the fields are impacted. That will directly inform how you present objects, where you stand, how you interact with the child. That field loss could be due to damage. It could be due to damage within the brain, but also damage within the eye. So we need to find out what the medical report says, what the FVA is telling you. There's a difference between damage to the eyes and damage to the brain centers. One is if there's a problem in the eye, that's not going to come back, and so you need to know that field is gone, and we present things in other places. If it's damage within the brain, we might go from the good area and move to the neglected area to try to encourage use in that field. So you have to talk to the DTV and find out what the strategy is that's going to be used. So here's another opportunity for application. So consider that same child, extreme CVI, still needs support in all those areas we mentioned before. As far as complexity, we also know that he has difficulty with the complexity. He's unable to organize people using visual information, or sorry, to recognize people using visual information. He does not find even familiar objects on busy backgrounds, and he neglects use of his upper visual field. So here's what the family wants to do. They say they want him to recognize his grandmother. What ways could this be accomplished? What do you think? Smell? Okay, use a different sense. That's definitely an option. Any other ideas? Okay, let me give you some ideas. Have grandmother wear something that is consistent. So that goes with the novelty. It's going to be the same every time. So yeah, Carla said identify accessories. Maybe she could wear a hat when she's with the baby, or certain earrings, or a scarf. I've seen one grandma who chose to wear a scarf every time she was with her grandchild. Or how about an apron? Or maybe not even visual, like somebody mentioned earlier. Just go with something that's not even a visual. Maybe do something. Maybe she could sing a certain song instead of saying hello, she sings a certain song that signifies her from somebody else. Maybe she does a certain massage with the baby, always rubs his left arm up and down or something. Maybe she gives him a kiss. So doing something to identify herself. Facial recognition is definitely difficult, so it's something that needs to be considered. Okay, one final thing, and if there's any questions, please put those in the chat box. One final thing, let me say just in closing. We need to, it's not necessary to use vision all the time. It might be something that you use, maybe not. But first you have to determine what supports are needed by the functional vision assessment. Then you identify daily routines that need to be accomplished. Decide if it should be visual or not, and then if so, figure out what supports can be put in place to make that happen. So are there any questions?
We have a couple, and we just have a minute or two to respond to questions. There was a question earlier about how CVI impacts feeding disorders, and there was some discussion kind of back and forth about that. Do you want to talk about how those two relate?
Well, just remember just remember that they're not going to have the same visual input, that the spoon is coming, what's on the spoon, they're not going to have that information, and so that wait time is really important, and the silence is really important. And those, using consistent materials like the same spoon with high contrast, you just use the characteristics and really support that. But certainly, feeding, if you stick something in my mouth and I don't know it's coming, I'm going to be defensive with that activity, and that can grow to be a huge problem. So, yes.
And would that also be, there was a question about whether CVI leads to tactile defensiveness, or, so I think it's probably the same kind of thing.
Yeah, visual impairment can lead to tactile defensiveness, in that it's that whole shock factor. If I don't see it coming, after a while I get really defensive about people grabbing me or shoving things at me and things like that. So it's best to give the wait time and yeah.
And then it looked like there was another, Susan wanted to know if gains can be made in facial recognition when that's affected.
I haven't seen research that says definitively one way or the other. I know it is one of the most difficult things, and so if it's going to resolve, it wouldn't be early. It would be one of the later things to resolve. But I haven't seen research that says definitively one way or the other.
Okay, well, I'm kind of looking through. There was another comment about oral exploration to let other areas of the brain see. So a lot of different strategies are kind of being shared. Just kind of to wrap up, Mindy, we're out of time, but I did put Mindy's email address up here, so if you do have questions specifically for Mindy, you can email her. I've known Mindy for years. She's an awesome resource, so and it's always been very helpful. So please, contact her if you have any other questions.